Picture a house, a proper house, not a ruin, not a tenement with 6 families stacked on top of each other like cordwood. A respectable house, the kind decent people aspire to, the kind with a brass knocker on the door and a bell pull that actually works and curtains that cost more than most people earn in a month. The kind of house where a maid answers the door in a clean apron, and the drawing room smells of dried flowers and beeswax polish, and everything looks, from the street, absolutely fine. Now imagine that the walls are trying to kill you. Imagine the water is trying to kill you. Imagine the floor beneath your feet is trying to kill you, and the paint on the nursery ceiling, and the coal in the grate, and the canister of flour in the kitchen that someone somewhere has helpfully cut with chalk and plaster dust because it's cheaper that way. Imagine the mattress you sleep on, the curtains you touch, the air you breathe in the room where the family eats their dinner every evening. That's where we're going tonight. The 1870s. England. A perfectly ordinary house on a perfectly ordinary street in a city that considers itself the most advanced, most civilized, most modern place on earth. And we're not going in through the front door with a visiting card and a polite knock. We're going in through the servants' entrance before the family's awake, when the house is cold and the fires haven't been lit and the truth of the place is still sitting there in the dark, unvarnished. Because the truth of the Victorian home is this: the people who built it didn't know what they were doing. Not really. They knew how to make it beautiful. They knew how to make it look like wealth and refinement and modern progress. They had opinions about wallpaper and strong feelings about dining room furniture and very specific ideas about how many courses a proper dinner should consist of. What they didn't know was that the green pigment in that beautiful wallpaper contained enough arsenic to make every person in the room chronically, mysteriously, continuously ill. They didn't know that the lead pipes carrying water into the house were slowly dissolving into every cup of tea, every pot of soup, every glass of water the children drank. They didn't know that beneath the flagstones in the kitchen, beneath the drawing room floor, beneath the nursery where the baby slept in its expensive cot, the cesspit was full. Not metaphorically full. Actually full. Seeping. Cracking. Sending invisible gases up through the soil and the foundations and the floorboards and into the air of rooms where people laughed and ate and slept and wondered why their heads always hurt. They didn't know, or they half knew and chose not to think about it. Or they thought about it and decided that their situation was really not so bad, that the smell was temporary, that the children's recurring fevers were just one of those things that happen to children, that the headaches were from the weather, that the cough that never quite went away was just the London air in winter, which everyone knows is not quite right. This is a story about what they didn't know. I make these history stories, and honestly, I have no real sense of whether any of you are sleeping to them, or whether you're all just lying there in your clean modern beds, breathing your clean modern filtered air, and quietly feeling superior to Victorians who lived inside their own poison. Either way, you're welcome. Settle in, get comfortable. Close your eyes if you want. Here we go. Your name is Agnes Hartley. You're 15 years old, and you've been awake for 20 minutes, and your hands are already bleeding, not badly. Just the knuckles. The skin cracks there first in winter, from the cold and the water and the lye soap, and the fact that you've been awake every morning this week before 5 o'clock, plunging your hands into water that someone has left to sit overnight in a bucket near the back door. And overnight in November in London means that there is a crust of ice on the surface, thin ice, The kind you break with the back of your hand and then pretend isn't ice. Because acknowledging the ice means acknowledging how cold you are. And how cold you are has nothing to do with anything you can change this morning, so you might as well get on with it. You are the housemaid at number 14 Alderton Street, Islington. You have been the housemaid at number 14 Alderton Street for 6 weeks. Before that, you were the scullery maid at a house in Stepney that smelled of fish, in a way that never quite left the walls regardless of what anyone did to them. And before that, you were helping your mother take in laundry in Hackney, which was fine except that there was almost never enough of it, and what there was got your mother's hands to the same state as yours are now, except worse. Worse and permanent. Her hands looked like the surface of the Thames at low tide, like something had tried to turn them to stone and only gotten halfway. You think about her hands sometimes when you break the ice in the bucket. The kitchen at number 14 is large by the standards of the houses you've worked in. There's a proper range along one wall, cast iron and black, which will need blacking and polishing before the mistress comes down, which means you are simultaneously breaking ice, building a fire in the range, and trying to locate the blacking brush in a drawer that has roughly 40 years of cooking equipment crammed into it, and hasn't been organised since probably before you were born. The kitchen smells of coal ash and grease and something underneath both of those. Something you noticed on your first morning and have stopped noticing since. The way you stop noticing most persistent smells after enough exposure. Your nose just accepts it and moves on. But it's still there, that underneath smell, something damp and old and organic. Something that comes up through the flagstone floor on cold mornings when the stone is at its coldest, and whatever is beneath it is doing whatever it does down there in the dark. You'll find out what it is, not for a while yet, but you will. Right now, your main problem is the fire. The range needs coal, and the coal is in the coal cellar, which is through a door at the back of the kitchen and down 3 steps into a space that is dark in the absolute sense. Not dark like a room with curtains drawn, but dark like the inside of a sealed box. Like being inside something rather than being a place you've entered. And the coal is in the far corner, and you feel your way to it with one hand on the cold stone wall, and you fill the scuttle by touch and sound, the scrape and tumble of coal shifting, and you haul it back up the 3 steps and into the kitchen, where the firelight from the range is beginning to catch, and you can actually see again. The coal you add to the range is good coal, household coal, nutty slack, whatever the coalman brought last week. It smells when it burns. Everything in London smells when it burns. The whole city smells of coal burning, all day, all winter. A smell that is part weather and part geography. A smell that gets into your hair and your clothes, and after a while you carry it with you everywhere. A portable London smell. And when you go back to visit your mother, she says you smell like the city, and you're never sure if that's a compliment. The fire catches. The kitchen begins very slowly to warm. You stand for a moment with your hands spread toward the range, feeling the heat come back into your knuckles, and this is the part of the morning you like best. This specific moment, this warmth coming back into cold hands, and you stand there for exactly as long as you can afford to, which is about 40 seconds. And then you pick up the blacking brush and start on the range, because Mrs. Hewson, who is the cook, and therefore your immediate superior in the kitchen, will be down in 30 minutes. And if the range isn't done, she'll give you a look that is worse than shouting. Mrs. Hewson doesn't shout. She has a look instead. You have been given the look twice in 6 weeks, and you are trying very hard not to make it a 3rd time. The blacking goes on with the brush and comes off with a cloth, and the range slowly goes from grey-black to proper black. the deep, even black of iron well maintained, and your hands are completely black by the time you're done, and you wash them in the bucket that is now no longer quite ice but still very cold, and you dry them on the rough towel that hangs by the back door, and the skin around your knuckles stings where it's cracked. And this is just how mornings are. The kitchen fire is going, the range is black, the kettle is on. In approximately 45 minutes, Mrs. Henderson will come down for breakfast, which means there will be two Mrs. Anythings in the same kitchen for the 20 minutes it takes for Mrs. Henderson, who is the mistress of the house, to have her tea and her toast and decide what today's meals should be. And Mrs. Hewson will handle this with the particular controlled pleasantness she uses for people she is, in the privacy of her own opinions, absolutely certain about. You've noticed that the more pleasant Mrs. Hewson becomes, the less pleasant she actually is. It's a reliable system. But you have 45 minutes before any of that, and you have work. The fires in the drawing room and the dining room and the study need lighting. Mrs. Henderson's bedroom fire will have gone cold in the night and needs relighting before she wakes. The ashes from yesterday need carrying out. The hearths need sweeping. The grates need brushing. And all of this before the household notices you doing it, because a good housemaid is invisible. The fires light themselves. The grates clean themselves. The coal appears by magic and the ash disappears by magic, and the machinery of the house operates silently and without evidence of human effort. And you are the ghost that makes all of this happen. You pick up the ash bucket and the hearth brush and go upstairs. The house at number 14 Alderton Street was built in 1851. You know this because the date is pressed into the terracotta above the front door, which you've cleaned twice since you arrived and will clean again before winter's over. 1851, the year of the Great Exhibition. The year Prince Albert convinced the country that progress was not just possible but inevitable, that science and industry and good British engineering would solve every problem, including presumably the problem of what to do with all the ash your fires produce and where to put everything that a household discards, and how to keep 6 people fed and clean and warm in a building that was designed to look impressive from the street and was slightly less carefully designed to be actually lived in. The house is 4 stories tall. Basement, ground floor, first floor, second floor, attic. You're in the attic. Your room is at the back, which means it looks out over the yard and the privy and the coal cellar rather than the street, which your predecessor apparently found dispiriting, and you have decided to consider practical, because the yard is where things happen. Things you want to know about. The stairs from the attic are narrow, servants' stairs, uncarpeted, functional. The kind of stairs that exist for the purpose of moving people up and down quickly without being seen or heard. The family uses the main staircase, which is wide and carpeted in a very dark red that you beat on Fridays, a job that takes an hour and raises enough dust to make you cough for the rest of the afternoon. The cough, by the way. You should know about the cough. Everyone in this house coughs. Mrs. Hewson coughs. Mr. Henderson coughs. The 2 children, Charlotte who is 9 and Edgar who is 5, cough more than anyone, which Mrs. Henderson attributes to the weather and the season, and the general susceptibility of children to winter ailments. And the doctor who came last March about Edgar's chest said something about tonics and fresh air, and recommended that Edgar not spend too much time near the open fires, which is excellent advice for a child living in a house with 7 open fires, except that it is completely impractical because the open fires are how the house is heated. You will not connect the cough to anything specific for a while. You're 15, and you have been coughing since you were 8, and you have never in your life lived somewhere where everyone didn't cough through the winter, and sometimes through the summer too. The cough is just what breathing is. You open the door to the drawing room. The drawing room at number 14 is the finest room in the house. This is the room where Mrs. Henderson receives visitors, where the family spends its evenings, where the piano that nobody plays particularly well stands in the corner, and the mantelpiece holds the china shepherdesses that need dusting every other day. It is also the coldest room in the house in the mornings because of the large windows that face north, and you feel the cold hit you as you push the door open. A specific drawing room cold, different from the kitchen cold. The drawing room cold has something refined about it, something that manages to be just as brutal but somehow more polite about it. You set down your bucket and your brush, and you kneel at the hearth. The ashes from yesterday's fire are grey and faintly warm still. Not warm enough to be dangerous, but warm enough to feel slightly alive. And you scoop them carefully into the bucket because ash that gets onto the carpet is ash. You'll be getting off the carpet later, and that is a problem you are proactively solving right now. You brush the grate clean. You lay the new fire, crumpled newspaper at the bottom, then the thin sticks of kindling that Mrs. Houston chops herself on Sunday mornings in the yard, then 2 pieces of coal placed just so at an angle to catch the draught from the chimney when the newspaper lights. You've become good at laying fires. 6 weeks ago you were competent. Now you are good. You can read a grate the way a doctor reads a pulse. You can tell from the way the draught moves whether the chimney is drawing properly, or whether there's something wrong up there, a bird's nest perhaps, or a partial obstruction from yesterday's unburned coal that's sitting at the wrong angle, and you adjust your kindling accordingly. It is a small skill. It is a real one. The firelights on the first match, you allow yourself a small moment of satisfaction, the way you always do when the fire lights on the first match. Because there is a particular misery to the fire that doesn't light on the first match and requires 3 and then 5, and then the careful rebuilding of the kindling while the cold settles deeper into your knees. And today is not that day. While the fire catches, while the small snap and crackle of burning newspaper fills the room and the first pale warmth begins to radiate outward, you stand and look at the drawing room in the early morning light. It is a beautiful room. The wallpaper is green, a deep, rich, botanical green, the colour of leaves in summer at the exact moment they are most alive, printed with a pattern of ferns and botanical curves that spiral up the wall from the skirting board to the cornice in an unbroken sweep of colour. It is the most fashionable wallpaper of its kind. It is the colour that everyone who is anyone is using in their drawing rooms right now, in 1873, in London, in all the respectable streets where respectable families are trying to live well and look modern and surround themselves with beauty. You have liked this wallpaper since your first morning. You look at it now in the low firelight, the green going deeper and more complex as the flames shift, and you think it is probably the most beautiful thing in the house. You will stop thinking that soon. But not yet. The fire is caught and you leave it to itself and move on to the dining room, then the study, and you light 3 more fires in 30 minutes, and by the time you're back in the kitchen for the hot water that Mrs. Henderson will want sent up to her room for washing, the range has got the kettle singing and Mrs. Houston has come downstairs in her dress and her apron and her expression of contained assessment, and she looks at your hands and she looks at the stove and she nods once, which is Mrs. Houston for good morning. The mistress wants porridge this morning, she says, and soft-boiled eggs 3 minutes, not 4. She said 4 last time was too long. You say nothing because there is nothing to say. You pour the hot water into the pitcher for Mrs. Henderson's room, settle it carefully so nothing spills on the white cloth you've draped over your arm, and you go upstairs again. Mrs. Henderson's room is on the first floor, the door is closed. You knock and wait, and when she says come in, you come in and you take the pitcher to the washstand and you pour the water into the basin and you set out the soap and the flannel and the towel and you go to the fireplace and you check that last night's embers are properly out before you lay the new fire, and you do all of this without speaking and without making more noise than is necessary, and without looking directly at Mrs. Henderson, who is sitting up in bed reading a letter with an expression on her face that is none of your business, and when everything is done you go to the door and she says Agnes, and you turn. She is a woman of about 40, not pretty in the way that people usually mean by pretty, but handsome in a more useful way, a face with good bones and a great deal of intelligence, and sometimes, when she forgets herself, something almost reckless in her eyes. She has been unwell for most of the 6 weeks you have been here. Not dramatically unwell, not ill in bed, just persistently, chronically, tiredly unwell, headaches that come and stay for days, fatigue that does not lift with sleep, a pallor that her husband attributes to the weather and her doctor attributes to a delicate constitution, and which she herself seems to regard with a kind of patient impatience, as though she has decided the illness is an inconvenience she will manage around rather than something to be solved. "Is the fire in the nursery lit?" she asks. "I'll do it next, ma'am," she nods. Edgar was coughing again in the night. "Yes, ma'am." "Can you check whether the flannel we put over his window is still in place? The cold comes in around the frame." You say you will, and you go to the nursery. The nursery is on the second floor at the front of the house. It is Edgar and Charlotte's room. Edgar is 5 and small for his age, and has the kind of face that makes adults want to protect him from things. Wide eyes and a particular thinness about his wrists and neck that suggests he's held together with something finer and more delicate than other children. Charlotte is 9 and built differently, sturdier, with her father's broad shoulders in miniature and a self-sufficiency that means she rarely needs anything from anyone and is slightly contemptuous of people who do. They are both asleep when you come in. Charlotte on her side, one arm flung out, deeply and completely unconscious the way children sleep, the way adults learn to envy. Edgar on his back, mouth slightly open, making a small sound that is not quite a snore and not quite a wheeze, but is somewhere in between, and your eye goes to his chest and watches it rise and fall, and it is rising and falling normally, just the small sound accompanying it, which Mrs. Henderson says has always been there, since he was very small. The flannel is still over the window frame. You press the edges more firmly into the gap, feeling the cold come through your fingertips, and you note the faint smell in the nursery, a smell you've been noticing since you arrived and haven't quite identified. Something sweet and dusty and slightly wrong, and you've put it down to the particular smell of children's rooms, of which you have limited experience because you have never worked in a house with children before. You lay the nursery fire. You are quiet. Neither child wakes. There is green wallpaper in the nursery too, not the same pattern as the drawing room. A different one, lighter, with small flowers, blue and white on the green ground. A nursery pattern, cheerful and innocent looking. Mrs. Henderson chose it herself, she mentioned once, from a pattern book that was brought from a shop in Oxford Street. She chose it for the green, which she finds restful. The fire catches. You leave. You will come back to the green wallpaper. The story of this house cannot be told without it. But first, there is breakfast to serve and fires to maintain and water to fetch, and the morning to get through. because the morning's always the heaviest part of the day, the part where the house demands the most from you. Before you've properly warmed up, and before you've eaten, and before the specific fatigue of yesterday has quite finished with you, down to the kitchen, fetch the coal, stoke the range, help Mrs. Hewson with the porridge, which involves standing over the pot and stirring without stopping, because porridge that sticks is the kind of domestic small tragedy that Mrs. Hewson takes personally. The smell of porridge cooking is good. It is one of the good smells of the morning, one of the things you can put in the positive column when you're doing the accounting that everyone in your position does, sometimes consciously, and sometimes just as a low background hum. This is hard, but the porridge smells good and the fire is lit and there is bread with dripping for your own breakfast at 6:30, and these things count. The eggs go on at 7:59. 3 minutes, not 4. You watch the clock on the kitchen wall, the one with the face that has gone slightly yellow from the years of coal smoke, and at 3 minutes you take them off, and you place them in their cups, and you bring the breakfast tray together, the porridge in its covered bowl, and the eggs in their cups, and the toast that Mrs. Hewson has made, and the pot of tea, and the small pot of marmalade, and you carry it all upstairs to the dining room where Mr. Henderson is already at the table reading his newspaper and not looking up. Mr. Henderson is a solicitor. He is 45 and methodical, and has a quality of occupying space very precisely, as though he has calculated exactly how much room he requires and taken that much and not a particle more. He thanks you for the breakfast without looking up, the way he always does, a reflex rather than an acknowledgement, and you set the things out on the table and you go. You pass the drawing room on your way back to the stairs. The fire has caught properly now, and the room is warming, and the green of the wallpaper in the firelight has gone deeper, that rich botanical green, and you stop for just a second in the doorway. Your grandmother in Hackney, you remember, told you once that green was bad luck. She was from somewhere in Norfolk originally, and she had a whole catalogue of things that were bad luck. Cats on stairs, and birds in the house, and green in a bedroom, and you've never known whether these were genuine folk beliefs or the accumulated worries of a woman who'd had a hard life and needed somewhere to put the anxiety. Probably both. Probably everything your grandmother believed was both. You do not think the wallpaper is bad luck. You're not yet thinking about the wallpaper at all, really. It is just wallpaper. It is just green. You do not know yet what is in it. By 9 o'clock the household is fully awake, and the work has shifted from the heavy early work of fires and water to the middle work of cleaning, and you're in the dining room with a cloth and a bottle of vinegar working on the windows, which the fog has turned grey with something that is not quite condensation and not quite grime, but is thoroughly both. London fog is not ordinary fog. London fog in November in 1873 has substance to it, a texture almost. The accumulated exhalations of 1,000,000 coal fires mixing with the river mist, and the effluent of the city's particular industries, the tanneries and the gasworks and the soap factories and the dye works and everything else that London runs on, all of it aloft together, coating surfaces, coating lungs, coating the inside of the window glass with the film that requires vinegar and effort to remove. You breathe it every time you open a window to clean the outside. You breathe it every time you go out to the yard. You breathe it walking to the shops and coming back, and it is in your hair and your clothes, and you stop noticing it the way you stop noticing the underground smell from the kitchen floor, because your body's practical, and it categorizes the things it can't change as background and moves on. This is the second hidden thing about the house, although you don't know it's hidden, and you don't know it's a thing. The air. Not just the outdoor air, which is bad enough. The indoor air, which in a sealed Victorian house in winter, with every window shut against the cold, and 7 open fires consuming coal, and every person breathing, and every lamp burning oil, and the gas jets in the hallway, and the drawing room burning their particular shade of yellow and emitting their particular trace of fumes. The indoor air in a house like this is remarkable in the specificity of its badness. Coal smoke contains carbon monoxide, not in the enormous quantities that will kill you quickly, not if the chimneys are drawing correctly, not at the concentrations that the chimney sweeps deal with, but in the small persistent amounts that come from a fire burning in a room with inadequate ventilation. And adequate ventilation in a Victorian house means windows open, which in winter means cold, which means the windows are closed, which means the ventilation is inadequate. Every day, every winter day, low-level carbon monoxide drifting from every grate in every room, all day. Carbon monoxide at low concentrations gives you headaches. It makes you tired. It makes it hard to think clearly. It makes you irritable and vaguely unwell in a way that is very difficult to pin down, in a way that feels like illness without quite being illness, in a way that a doctor in 1873 would look at and say, constitution, or nervous disposition, or the weather, or any of the 100 explanations that doctors of this era reach for because they do not yet have the instruments to measure parts per million in the air of a Victorian drawing room. Mrs. Henderson has headaches. She has had headaches since she moved into this house 7 years ago. She considers them her particular affliction, her private cross, and she manages them with patience and small doses of laudanum that she keeps in the cabinet in her room, and which she uses less than some and more than she would prefer. She does not consider the drawing room as a possible cause. Why would she? The drawing room is beautiful and comfortable and warm. The drawing room is the nicest room in the house. You finish the windows. You move on to dusting the dining room, which means every surface, including the area behind the picture frames where dust accumulates with an industry that suggests it has somewhere to be. The way London dust always seems purposeful, always heading somewhere, always colonising the next flat surface. Mrs. Henderson comes down at 10 o'clock, later than usual, and she looks as she often does in the mornings, slightly ashen around the eyes, slightly careful about her movements, as though her head is a fragile object she's carrying. She asks after the children, goes upstairs to the nursery, and you hear her talking to Edgar in the gentle voice she uses with him, different from the voice she uses for Charlotte, more careful. Edgar has been coughing since October. Mrs. Henderson mentioned it to Dr. Graves, who came on the 6th of November and listened to his chest with a stethoscope that Edgar was fascinated by, and who said his lungs sounded clear and that the cough was almost certainly catarrhal and would resolve with the season, and that he should have his window opened for 20 minutes each morning to let in fresh air. The window in the nursery now has the flannel pressed over the frame to block the cold that comes in around it. This is because when Mrs. Henderson opened it for the 20 minutes that Dr. Graves recommended, it was 4 degrees below freezing outside, and the room lost heat so fast that Edgar's breakfast went cold before we could finish it. The flannel is a compromise between the doctor's advice and the physical reality of November in London. The cold is kept out. So is the air that Dr. Graves prescribed. Nobody wins. By 11 the house is into its working rhythm, and you have been upstairs and downstairs 5 times already, and the coal scuttle needs refilling in the drawing room and the study both. The house consumes coal the way a healthy person consumes food, constantly, hungrily, and you are the system by which the coal moves from the cellar to the grates, which means by 11 you have made the journey to the coal cellar 7 times, and your arms know it. You are filling the scuttle in the coal cellar when you notice the smell more strongly than usual. The underground smell, the one from the kitchen floor. It is stronger down here, which is logical because the coal cellar is further below the house, and whatever is producing the smell is producing it from below the house or from within the foundations. But stronger here means you can begin to analyse it, and you stand in the coal cellar with the scuttle half full and the smell filling your nose, and you try to figure out what it is. Damp. Definitely damp. Old, settled, architectural damp. The kind that lives in Victorian foundations with the cheerful permanence of a sitting tenant, because Victorian houses were built quickly and built for appearance, and built with the implicit assumption that damp was just a thing that happened, and the furniture would be arranged to cover the worst of the marks on the walls. But underneath the damp there's something else. Something that is not quite rot and not quite sewage, but contains elements of both. Something organic and enclosed and very old. You fill the scuttle. You go back upstairs. You do not think about the smell particularly. You've thought about it before, and you've concluded that coal cellars smell because they do, and that the smell must be normal for this house, because everyone else in the house seems to have accepted it. And when the adults in a house accept a thing, it becomes, by working definition, a thing that is acceptable. This is one of the great mechanisms of the Victorian household, the normalisation of hazard. Not through malice or ignorance, but through the simple accumulated weight of acceptance, through the fact that this is how things are and how things have been, and why would you question the smell from the coal cellar when there are fires to light and eggs to boil, and a mistress who needs her windows cleaned? You bring the coal to the drawing room, you tend the fire, you close the door on the green wallpaper and go to find Mrs. Hewson to ask about dinner preparations. Let me tell you about the water. The water comes into number 14 through a pipe, a lead pipe, because lead pipes are what you build water systems from. Lead has been used for plumbing since the Romans, literally since the Romans. The Latin word for lead is plumbum, and that is why the people who work with pipes are plumbers, and why the word plumbing exists. Because the Romans built their entire water infrastructure in lead and left this gift to subsequent civilizations. The Romans, by the way, had a great deal of collective lead poisoning, and historians have spent a very long time arguing about how much this contributed to the decline of their empire, which is a rich discussion, and one that nobody in Victorian England is having because they are too busy laying lead pipes. The pipe enters the house from the street main and runs to the kitchen and to the cold water tap over the kitchen sink. There is also a cistern in the attic, a large lead-lined wooden box that stores water for the household's use, gravity-fed from the main, and from this cistern the water is distributed to the wash basins on the first and second floors. The water sits in the cistern for days at a time, sometimes longer. The lead liner of the cistern is old, installed when the house was built in 1851, 22 years ago, and lead in water does not corrode the way iron does not produce visible rust, does not give the water a colour or a clear smell. Lead in water dissolves. Slowly, gradually, invisibly, it becomes the water. Every cup of tea, every pot of porridge, every bowl of water used for washing hands, every glass of water that Edgar drinks when he's thirsty in the night, which he is, often, which he always has been, which Mrs. Henderson knows because she gets up to give it to him. Lead in water at the concentrations produced by old lead pipes and cisterns is not enough to kill you quickly. It is enough to accumulate. In children especially, whose developing nervous systems and whose growing brains are operating at a level of biological complexity and delicacy that makes them particularly susceptible to things that disrupt those processes. Lead accumulates in bones, It interferes with the production of blood cells. It affects the development of the nervous system. It causes fatigue and pallor and recurring illness and difficulty with focus and a particular kind of developmental delay that is slow and subtle and looks, from the outside, like a child who is not quite thriving, not quite unwell, just somehow running a bit below what you might hope for. Edgar is not quite thriving. He is not quite unwell. He is not, in any way that a doctor in 1873 can measure, definitively ill. He is thin and prone to coughs and headaches, and he tires easily, and his reading has not progressed as fast as Charlotte's did at his age. Mr. Henderson attributes this to his constitution. Mrs. Henderson attributes it to the winter. The doctor attributes it to catarrh and a delicate nature and recommends tonics. Nobody attributes it to the water. Why would they? The water looks fine. The water tastes fine. Or rather, it tastes like London water, which everyone knows is not the finest water in the world, but is perfectly serviceable. And there is no visible evidence of anything wrong with it. And the concept of invisible dissolved metals in the domestic water supply is not, in 1873, a concept that has made its way from the theoretical into the practical consciousness of the middle-class household. There are people who know or who suspect. There are sanitary reformers who've been writing about lead pipes for decades. There are doctors who have noticed correlations they cannot quite explain. But the knowledge that exists in the theoretical realm and the knowledge that operates in a specific house on a specific street are two different things, and the second kind travels slowly. You draw water from the kitchen tap every morning. You fill the kettle and the porridge pot and the washing up basin and the pitchers for the bedrooms. You never think about the water. The water is just water. The afternoon passes in the particular rhythm of a Victorian household afternoon. More coal, more fires tended, silver polished in the pantry, which is a task that takes 40 minutes and leaves your hands smelling of chalk and ammonia and the particular metallic undertone of silver polish that you associate with Tuesdays, because Tuesday is Silver Day. The smell gets into your nose and stays there for hours, blunting everything else. At 3:30, Edgar comes down from the nursery with Charlotte, both of them released from the morning's lessons, and they come through the kitchen because the kitchen is warm, and because Edgar likes to watch the cooking and Charlotte likes to steal small things from the larder and pretend she didn't. You are aware of both of these behaviours. Mrs. Hewson is aware of both. There is an implicit household agreement that the afternoon kitchen visit is a thing that happens and is permitted. And you give Edgar the end of a loaf to chew on, and Charlotte pretends not to have put a handful of raisins in her pocket, and Mrs. Hewson doesn't look up from her pastry. Edgar sits at the kitchen table and watches you work with the focused attention he brings to most things. He has a very particular quality of attention, this boy. A stillness when something interests him that makes him seem older than he is, and he watches you peel potatoes with the expression of someone observing a procedure that might be of use later. "Agnes," he says, "why is the wall wet?" You look where he's pointing. There is a patch of wall by the back door low down above the skirting board that is darker than the rest, and when you look at it properly, which you've perhaps been avoiding doing, you can see that it is not just dark, it is soft-looking, the plaster slightly swollen, the paint above it crazed with fine cracks where the moisture has pushed at it from beneath. "Rising damp," says Mrs. Hewson, still not looking up from her pastry. This is not entirely correct, but it is the kind of explanation that contains enough truth to serve the purpose of ending the conversation. which is what Mrs. Hewson requires from explanations. Rising damp is the name given to moisture that travels upward through masonry via capillary action, which is what water does in porous materials, which is what Victorian brick and mortar absolutely are. It is a real phenomenon. It is present in most Victorian houses to some degree. It is responsible for the darkening of lower walls and the smell of occupied damp rooms, and the particular heaviness of winter air in houses that were built quickly of porous materials and expected to manage the fact of sitting on wet London soil for 100 years. But the patch by the back door is not quite rising damp, or not only. You go over and press your finger gently against the plaster, and it gives slightly, the way things give that are no longer structurally sound, the way things give when whatever was inside them is no longer there, but the shell remains, and there is the smell, closer here, the organic underground smell, and you understand that the water is coming from the wrong direction, not up, through. Something outside is saturating the wall from the other side. You look at Edgar. He's watching you with his particular attention. It's been like that a while, you say. It makes my chest feel funny, he says. You do not know what to do with this. You say, I'll mention it to your mother, and you mean it. And you do mention it to Mrs. Henderson that evening when she comes to the kitchen to consult with Mrs. Hewson about Friday's dinner. And Mrs. Henderson says, yes, I've noticed it too. I'll ask Mr. Henderson to have someone look at the foundations, and Mr. Henderson will be asked eventually, and someone will come to look, and when they do, they will find something, but that is weeks away yet. And in the meantime, the wall is wet, and Edgar sits near it every afternoon, and breathes the air that rises through the floor of the coal cellar, and collects in the basement kitchen, and contains something that has travelled from a distance that you are not yet ready to measure. Let me tell you about what is beneath the house. Number 14. Alderton Street, built in 1851, has a cesspit beneath the rear yard. This is not unusual. Islington in 1873 is connected to the new sewers that Sir Joseph Bazalgette built in the aftermath of the Great Stink. That extraordinary summer of 1858, when the Thames became so overwhelmingly, impossibly, parliamentarily offensive, that the legislature finally committed to doing something about the fact that London's 800,000 cesspits and its assorted gutters and ditches were all emptying into the river, from which the city also drew its drinking water, and the river responded to this arrangement by announcing its presence in a way that could not be ignored even by people who'd been trying very hard to ignore it for decades. Bazalgette's sewers, by 1873, serve most of the city. Most, not all. The sewers were built under the streets, and the houses connect to them at the point where the house drain meets the street drain, and this requires a connection, and the connection requires maintenance, and maintenance requires someone to notice that the connection needs maintenance, and to care about it, and to have the money to do it, and the will to do it, and in some cases the connection was made improperly in the first place, and has been failing slowly for years, and in some cases the cesspit was simply left in place when the house was connected to the sewer, and nobody bothered to properly decommission it, and in some cases, in quite a lot of cases, the cesspit is still there, still partially in use, still receiving the drainage from the house. That doesn't make it all the way to the sewer connection, and it is full, and it has been full for years, and the brick walls of it, which were built in 1851 and were not the finest work of their kind even then, have developed cracks, and through these cracks, slowly, patiently, with all the geological inevitability of water finding its way through anything, The contents of the cesspit are moving outward through the soil and toward the foundations of the house, and through the foundations, and into the walls, and up through the soil of the yard, especially after heavy rain, especially in the winter when the water table rises. This is the third hidden thing about number 14. The house is sitting on its own waste, not in the dramatic, catastrophic, immediately obvious way that houses in the worst slums sit on their waste, where the cellar floods with sewage and the walls run with it, and every child in the street has cholera before their 3rd birthday. Not that. Nothing so clear and identifiable. Just the slow, invisible migration of contaminated groundwater through porous Victorian foundations. Just the faint smell that everyone has accepted as characteristic of old houses. Just the bacteria that live in saturated soil, making their quiet way into the fabric of the building. You go upstairs. You take the silver back to the dining room and arrange it in the cabinet. The daylight is already gone. It goes so fast in November, and you light the gas lamps in the hall and the drawing room, reaching up with the taper to each jet, and the gas catches with that particular soft puff, and the light blooms, yellow and warm and slightly inadequate. The light that defines Victorian evenings, that warm yellowy glow that looks beautiful in paintings and in memories, and which, in the rooms where it burns, is adding its small, continuous contribution to the domestic air. Gas lamps in a sealed room, the products of combustion. Nobody thinks about this either. The lamps are comfortable. They are better than candles. They're modern and reliable, and they smell a little, yes, slightly sweet, slightly unidentifiable. But that is just the smell of gas lamps. Everyone knows gas lamps have a smell, and you open the windows occasionally in the summer, but in November the windows stay closed and the gas lamps burn. Mr. Henderson comes home at 5:30. You hear the front door, the particular heavy click of the latch, and then his footsteps in the hall. Deliberate, patterned, a man who knows his own house by the sound of his steps in it, and Mrs. Henderson comes out of the morning room where she's been writing letters, and there is the quiet sound of a marriage functioning. 2 people exchanging the small currency of a shared day. And you go to take his coat and his hat and his case, and you hang them in the hall cupboard and bring him his newspaper, which arrived at 2 and has been sitting on the hall table since. The evening meal is at 7. You spend the intervening time helping Mrs. Hewson with the preparation, which tonight is a leg of mutton and potatoes and a sweet pudding for afters, and you lay the table in the dining room with the silver and the white cloth and the good candlesticks, and you bring the food up from the kitchen in successive trips, and Mr. and Mrs. Henderson eat their dinner, and you bring the dishes in and take them out, and the children eat theirs in the nursery, and Charlotte complains about the mutton, and Edgar eats his quietly and doesn't complain about anything. After dinner there is the clearing and the washing up and the banking of the range for the night and the checking of the fires, the drawing room fire damped down but not extinguished, the hall fire out, the study fire out, the bedroom fires rebuilt for the night, and by 9 o'clock you've been on your feet for 16 hours, and your back is speaking to you in a way that is somewhere between complaint and threat, and your hands have gone past cold into a sort of numbness that you know from experience will resolve into proper pain when you finally get them warm. You go upstairs to your room in the attic. The room is small, a bed, a washstand, a chair, a small window. The walls are plain, unpapered, whitewashed, which is one of the advantages of being the housemaid rather than a member of the family. Your walls are plain and your walls are safe. But the room is cold, genuinely cold, because the attic is the last thing to warm up and the first thing to lose it, and you undress quickly and pull the extra blanket over yourself and you lie in the dark and listen to the house. The house makes sounds at night. Victorian houses always do. The wood contracting as the temperature drops, the pipes making their occasional tick, tick, tick as the water in them changes temperature, the settle and sigh of a coal-fired building slowly cooling from the outside in. Below you, 4 floors of domestic architecture breathing in the dark, and you are at the top of it listening. You're tired enough to sleep immediately. You almost always are. But tonight something keeps you awake for a few minutes longer than usual. Some unresolved quality in the day, and you lie in the dark and let your mind turn over the things you've noticed. The wet wall in the kitchen, Edgar's comment, makes my chest feel funny. The smell. You're not a suspicious person. You are not, by inclination or training, someone who looks at a house and sees danger. You're someone who looks at a house and sees work, which is what your position requires and what your experience has taught you. But there is something about this house that you've been circling around since your first week. Some quality of wrongness that you haven't been able to name, and tonight it feels closer to a name. You fall asleep. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon in December, the plumber comes. His name is Mr. Briggs, and he arrives in a cart, and he is exactly what a plumber in 1873 looks like. A large man, large in the way of physical work, with forearms that could close around your upper arm with room to spare, wearing heavy clothes that are permanently stained in the particular way of his trade, a combination of minerals and black compounds and the residue of pipes that have been doing their work for decades. He carries a bag that clanks. He smells of solder and pipework and something you can't identify, and he looks at the wet wall with the professional assessment of a man who has seen many wet walls and has formed strong opinions about them. You are the one who lets him in, and Mrs. Henderson takes him to the kitchen to show him the wall, and you stand in the doorway listening because you want to understand and because nobody has told you not to. "Cesspit," says Mr. Briggs, not dramatically, as a fact. Mrs. Henderson looks at him. "I beg your pardon?" "Your cesspit, ma'am. It's leaking. Or it was never properly decommissioned when you connected to the main sewer. Either way, the ground behind this wall is saturated with it, and it's coming through." He presses his hand flat against the wall in the same way you pressed your finger, feeling the give. You'll need the cesspit properly excavated and filled, and the foundations repointed where they've cracked. That's not a small job. Mrs. Henderson is quiet for a moment. "How long has it been like this?" Mr. Briggs looks at the wall, looks at the floor, looks at the way the damp has travelled up the skirting board, the dark line of it rising, faint but definite, 2 feet from the ground. "Years," he says. "At least a few. You'd have noticed the smell." There is silence in the kitchen. "I thought it was the coal cellar," says Mrs. Henderson. "That too, probably, but this is the main source." She thanks him with a controlled pleasantness that you have learned to read as something closer to horror held very still, and she asks him to return on Thursday with his estimate, and when he leaves she stands in the kitchen for a moment that she probably doesn't know you are witnessing, and then she straightens her back and goes upstairs. That evening after dinner you hear Mr. and Mrs. Henderson talking in the drawing room. The door is not quite closed. You are passing in the hall on your way from the dining room. You do not stop. But you hear Mrs. Henderson say, "Mr. Briggs says the children may have been breathing it." And Mr. Henderson says, "I'm sure Briggs exaggerates these things." And Mrs. Henderson says, "Edgar's chest," in a voice that contains everything she isn't saying. You continue down the hall. You don't stop. None of this is your business. But you carry it with you, that fragment of conversation, the way you carry everything in this house, quietly, in the part of you that is always watching. This cesspit work starts the following Monday. Mr. Briggs comes with 2 other men and they excavate the rear yard, which means the kitchen smells of excavation all day, fresh earth and old things that have been covered over. And Mrs. Hewson makes tea for the men at 11 and at 3 and keeps her expression of contained assessment throughout. And by the end of the first day there is a hole in the yard and a strong smell that is no longer ambiguous about its origins. And Mrs. Henderson moves the children to the first floor sitting room for their lessons and keeps the kitchen windows closed. The cesspit is not just leaking. One wall has collapsed, the brickwork crumbling into the underlying fill, and the material from it has been spreading through the surrounding soil for what Mr. Briggs estimates, conservatively, is 4 or 5 years. The foundations of the rear wall of the house, in the section nearest the cesspit, have absorbed what they've absorbed, and the repointing Mr. Briggs described will need to be more extensive than his first estimate suggested. Mr. Henderson takes this news with the particular stoicism of a man who has received bad news about something financial, and is engaged in the process of converting the emotional response into practical steps. He asks about costs, he asks about timelines, he asks whether the structural integrity of the house is compromised. He does not ask about the children's health, or whether the 4 or 5 years of contaminated groundwater working through his basement has had consequences beyond the repair costs. He is not a callous man. He is a man of his time, operating with the tools available to him, and the tool of understanding what invisible contamination does to growing bodies is not one that exists in a form accessible to him in 1873. He knows in the broad way that educated Victorians know things, that sewage causes disease, the cholera outbreaks, the typhoid. These things are understood in their broad outlines. But the mechanism, the specific transmission, the idea of bacterial contamination travelling through groundwater and walls and floor, of it being breathed, of it touching skin and hands and mouths without anyone seeing it happen, this is not yet knowledge that exists in the form of practical household management. John Snow proved the water cholera connection in 1854 by removing the handle from the Broad Street pump. Germ theory is being developed right now, in 1873, by Pasteur in France and Koch, who will make his crucial discoveries later in this decade. The pieces exist, they are assembling, but they are assembling in laboratories and in the pages of medical journals, and in the lectures of doctors who are ahead of their profession, and they are not assembling in the drawing room or the nursery or the kitchen of number 14 Alderton Street, not yet. The walls are dry by February, or drier. The repointing takes most of January and costs more than anyone had hoped, and there is a new brick-lined cesspit shaft filled with rubble, and sealed at the top where the old one was, and the kitchen doesn't smell the same way it did, or rather the underground smell is less, noticeably less. And Mrs. Hewson one morning in February says to you straight-faced, "The kitchen smells better," which from Mrs. Hewson is an entire statement of emotional position, and you say, "It does." And there is a small shared acknowledgement between you that this is an improvement that should have happened earlier, that there was something wrong that has now been made less wrong, and that the something wrong was not nothing. Edgar's cough does not go away. By March it is better, as it always is in spring when the coal fires are used less, and by June he runs in the garden with something closer to his expected energy. Mrs. Henderson marks the improvement with a kind of careful happiness, not allowing herself to be certain about it. Edgar himself does not know the winter was different from other winters, because this is only his second winter that he is old enough to remember. But I want to talk to you about the wallpaper The wallpaper deserves its own moment because the wallpaper is the most extraordinary part of this story, the part that is hardest to believe and is completely true, the part where the history of industrial chemistry and the history of Victorian taste and the history of domestic poisoning all arrive at the same point simultaneously and produce something that is genuinely astonishing. The green of Victorian wallpaper was achieved in two ways. The earlier and more common method involved a pigment called Scheele's green, invented by the Swedish chemist Carl Wilhelm Scheele in 1775, which was a copper arsenite, meaning it was made from copper and arsenic combined into a compound that produced an extraordinary, brilliant botanical green unlike anything previously available. It was a revelatory colour. Painters and dyers and decorators went wild for it. It was used in paints and dyes and inks and fabrics and wallpapers from the late 18th century onward with growing enthusiasm because it was cheap and it was beautiful and it held its colour in ways that other greens didn't. And it was made of arsenic. That is the thing. That is the detail that is worth sitting with for a moment. That the most fashionable colour in Victorian England, the colour on drawing room walls and nursery walls and dining room walls, and the walls of children's bedrooms across the country, was a compound in which arsenic was not an impurity or a trace element, but a structural component, present in significant quantities, present in the percentage sense, and the paper that contained it was covering walls in sealed rooms where people spent their entire lives. The problem is not that you eat the wallpaper. You don't eat the wallpaper. The problem is older and stranger and involves a mould. In 1893, a doctor named William Gosio will discover that a common household mould called Scopulariopsis brevicalis, which grows in damp conditions on organic wallpaper paste, metabolizes arsenic compounds and converts them into a volatile gas. The gas is trimethylarsine. It is colourless. It has a faint garlic smell when present in significant concentrations, a smell so faint in typical domestic situations that most people never notice it, and it is toxic. The mould needs two things to grow, organic paste and damp. Victorian wallpaper was hung on walls with paste made from starch, which is organic. Victorian houses were damp. The combination produced ideal growing conditions for Scopulariopsis brevicoles, which grew behind the wallpaper in large colonies and produced trimethylarsine in quantities that varied with the temperature and humidity of the room, the extent of the mould growth, and the amount of arsenic in the paper. This is not a minor detail. William Morris's own wallpaper workshop used arsenic-containing pigments. Napoleon, dying in exile on St. Helena, was almost certainly being slowly poisoned by his green bedroom wallpaper and the damp island climate and the mould that grew behind it. The argument about whether Napoleon was deliberately poisoned with arsenic or died of his own wallpaper is a genuinely unresolved historical question, which is remarkable. An emperor of the French, potentially killed by interior decoration. In England, throughout the 1860s and 1870s, there is a growing and periodically heated discussion about arsenic in wallpaper. The Medical Times publishes concerns. Individual doctors write letters to newspapers. There are cases, documented cases, of families becoming ill in houses with green wallpaper, recovering when the wallpaper is removed, becoming ill again when similar wallpaper is installed elsewhere. The wallpaper manufacturers deny everything. There is no proof. There is association, not causation. There is the difficulty of proving an invisible gas in a Victorian drawing room. There is the problem that arsenic poisoning at low chronic doses looks like many other things. chronic gastritis, nervous exhaustion, constitutional weakness, the general mysterious female ailment that Victorian medicine packages as hysteria, or neurasthenia, or delicacy of constitution. Women in particular, who spend more time in the domestic interior than men who go out to offices and courts and shops, experience the effects more consistently, and the medical establishment of the 1870s has a diagnosis already prepared for women who are persistently and mysteriously unwell, a diagnosis that does not require looking at the walls. The drawing room at number 14 Alderton Street has Shields green wallpaper. The nursery has a different product, a newer wallpaper using a different arsenic compound called Paris green, which was formulated in the 1810s and became enormously popular in the 1840s and 1850s for its even more brilliant vivid colour, a colour that said to everyone who saw it, wealth, taste, modernity. Both compounds release arsenic into the air under the right conditions. Both compounds in a damp room with organic wallpaper paste and no ventilation can sustain a colony of gas-producing mould. In the winter of 1873, with the windows sealed, the coal fires burning, and the cistern water keeping the walls at a permanent level of mild dampness, the drawing room at number 14 is operating at something close to optimal conditions for arsenic gas production. Mrs. Henderson's headaches, her persistent fatigue, her pallor that the doctor calls constitutional, the way she improves in the summers when the windows are open and the fires are not lit and the house breathes more freely, the way she declines again each November, reliably, when the fires come back on and the windows close. You notice this without understanding it. You notice it because you are the one who tends the fires and opens and closes the windows and reads the rhythm of the house through the physical work of maintaining it. You know that Mrs. Henderson is better in July than in January. You assume this is the weather. Everyone assumes it is the weather. You also notice, somewhere in the middle of January, that you have a persistent headache of your own. It comes and goes. It is worse in the drawing room than in the kitchen, though you spend far less time in the drawing room. You ascribe this to the close work of dusting and cleaning in a cold room, to the fact that you're perhaps not eating enough, to the fact that you're always slightly tired, to many things that are plausible and none of which are the wallpaper. Your headaches go away when you go home to visit your mother in Hackney in February for 2 days, which is your holiday allowance. They come back when you return. February in a Victorian house means the coal fires are at their peak use, which means the coal situation dominates the domestic economy in a way that is difficult to overstate. The house burns coal in 7 grates. The kitchen range runs all day. The quantity of coal consumed per week in winter is measured in hundredweights, and the coalman comes on Thursdays and the delivery is a production. The cart and horse stopping in the street and the coal being carried in sacks through the yard gate and down to the cellar, and you count the sacks because Mrs. Henderson has asked you to count the sacks, because the coalman's arithmetic has been questionable in the past. The coal is good coal. It burns hot and relatively clean. But coal burning in a closed Victorian fireplace, even good coal, even with a properly drawing chimney, even under ideal conditions, produces soot and ash and sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides and carbon monoxide in quantities that are not trivial to breathe every day for 6 months of the year. The soot is the visible part. It deposits on every horizontal surface. You dust it daily from the mantelpieces, the picture frames, the tops of books. You beat it weekly from the carpets, which is where most of it ends up, driven down by footsteps and settling from the air, until the carpet is a reservoir of everything the air has carried. The coal dust in the air, the ash disturbed when the grates are cleaned, the soot that falls back down the chimney, all of it in the carpet, all of it released back into the air every time someone walks across the room. Your lungs know about the carpet, even if you don't think about it consciously. The slightly tight feeling on the days after carpet beating. The way your nose runs when you're working in a dusty room. The cough that you have always had and that Edgar has and that Mrs. Hewson has, and that is, in this household, simply the sound of winter, simply the sound of everyone breathing what there is to breathe. In March, Charlotte develops a rash. It comes up on her arms, a fine scaly rash, not the red blotches of measles or the pustules of smallpox, nothing dramatic, just a persistent itchiness below the elbow that she scratches in her sleep and wakes with angry marks on. The doctor says eczema. He says it is common in children with sensitive skin. He recommends calamine lotion and suggests her underclothes be changed to a softer material. Charlotte's bedroom is at the back of the second floor, not the nursery which she considers herself too old for. Her own room, given to her last year when she turned 8. It has blue wallpaper, not green, with a pattern of small yellow flowers, and it is properly blue, a mineral blue, a safe blue in the sense of its particular chemistry. But the room is cold and damp, and the wallpaper was hung against a wall that has a north-facing exterior, and the paste behind it has never fully dried, and there is something growing behind the blue paper in the same way something grows behind the green, a different mould producing different compounds, because damp is not selective about what it cultivates. Damp in Victorian walls is not romantic. It is not the gentle dampness of old stone churches or the picturesque damp of ruins. It is active, biological, territorial. It grows things. It feeds things. It creates microclimates behind wallpaper and beneath floorboards and in the fabric of walls that have been asked to hold more moisture than they were designed for. And what grows in those microclimates is not nothing, is not neutral, is not simply a question of aesthetics. The Victorians knew about damp. They wrote about damp. The sanitary movement that grew through the 1840s and 1850s had damp at its centre, was in many ways a war against damp, a recognition that wet houses killed people even when the mechanism wasn't understood, that the death rates in damp courts were higher than in aired streets, that children in basement rooms with water running down the walls died at rates that respectable people found shocking when the figures were finally assembled. They knew, but knowing it as a public health principle and acting on it in your own particular house were different things, and the action required was expensive and disruptive, and involved ripping out things that were beautiful and replacing them with things that were merely functional, and the money might not be there, and the disruption might not be acceptable, and the children's coughs were always just a little bit better when the weather improved, and there was always a good reason to wait until next year. You're learning all of this by living inside it, not abstractly, not from a pamphlet, from the smell in the cold cellar and the wet wall in the kitchen, and the way the housemaid 2 streets over told you last summer when you met her at the pump that the child in her house had been ill all winter, and the mistress blamed the fog, and the cook blamed the butcher's meat, and nobody blamed the house itself. Nobody thought to blame the house. The house is not supposed to be the problem. The house is supposed to be the solution. You save money and you find a house, and the house is what you have. The house is what you've worked for, and you keep it clean and you keep it warm and you paper the walls with beautiful patterns and you make it look like the civilization you believe you are part of. And it should be. It should simply be a house, a place to live, a safe enclosure against everything that is outside. But there is no sharp line in a Victorian house between outside and inside. The London air comes through every gap. The groundwater comes up through every crack. The coal smoke fills every room regardless of the chimney's drawer, and the wallpaper, the beautiful wallpaper, is breathing arsenic into the drawing room air at a rate that varies with the temperature and the damp and the time of year. April. Something changes in April that is worth describing in detail because it will matter later. You are cleaning the drawing room on a Tuesday morning. The wallpaper behind the large sofa, the section that is rarely seen because the sofa sits close to the wall, and you move the sofa to clean behind it, which you do quarterly, and when you move the sofa you see the wall. The wall behind the sofa is wrong. The paper has blistered. Not dramatically, not in a way that would catch the eye across the room, but the surface of it is uneven, in the way of paper that has been pushed forward from behind, a series of small bulges, like something pressing outward from within the wall, and the colour, the deep botanical green, is slightly different here, slightly yellowish in a few places, and there is a smell from this section of wall that is stronger than the rest of the room, an addition to the usual drawing room smell of coal and beeswax and dried flowers, something that has an organic quality, something that you try to identify and cannot. It is faint, faint enough that if you weren't directly behind the sofa with your face close to the wall, you wouldn't notice it. Faint enough that standing in the middle of the room, you would say the room smells perfectly normal, but you are close to the wall and you notice. You stand back, you look at the blistered section, you push the sofa back into place and you think about it for the rest of the morning, and you mention it to Mrs. Hewson at lunchtime, not as a crisis, just as a thing you have noticed. And Mrs. Hewson says damp in the walls and goes back to her pastry. You're not satisfied with damp in the walls as a full explanation, but you do not have a better one, and the quality of your authority in this house is not such that you can walk into the drawing room and begin removing wallpaper to investigate the blisters behind the sofa. So you file it in the same place you've been filing the other things you've noticed, the underground smell and the wet wall and Edgar's chest and Mrs. Henderson's headaches and Charlotte's rash. You are building a picture. You don't know yet what the picture shows. Let me tell you about the food. The larder at number 14 is a small room off the kitchen, north-facing, cool, with a marble shelf along one wall and hooks above for hanging meat. In 1873 there is no refrigeration in the domestic sense. There will not be mechanical refrigeration in ordinary middle-class homes for another 50 years. What there is instead is the cool room, the north-facing room, the marble shelf that stays cold because marble conducts heat away from whatever you put on it, the careful management of what gets used when, the reliance on purchasing fresh each day rather than storing. Mrs. Hewson goes to the market on Monday, Wednesday and Friday mornings. She buys meat and fish and vegetables and dairy, and she brings them back and they go into the larder and they are used mostly within a day or two of purchase. This is the system. It is a good system within its limitations. The limitations are as follows. The meat comes from butchers whose standards of storage are not always consistent. In summer, this is a genuine crisis, meat going off within hours in the heat, and there is a summer practice of buying very small amounts very frequently, almost daily, and using every piece before it has a chance to turn. But in winter, in a cold larder, meat that is slightly off when it arrives may not smell off immediately. It may sit on the marble shelf and look and smell acceptable for a day and a half before it announces its condition. And by the time it announces its condition, it is already in the pot. It is already the stew. It is already part of the casserole that Mrs. Henderson will compliment as particularly good tonight, with a specific warmth that means she is feeling better than yesterday. Gastrointestinal illness in 1873 is chronic background noise in the middle-class household. The stomach complaints, the bilious attacks, the days in bed with the basin near the bed and the general misery of it. These are not considered particularly alarming unless they are severe or persistent. Everyone has them. Children have them. Adults have them. The doctor prescribes bismuth or chalk mixture or something stronger if the case warrants, and it passes, and the house returns to normal, and nobody investigates why Mr. Henderson spent Tuesday in bed in February, and Edgar spent 3 days similarly disposed in March, and Mrs. Henderson has what she calls her stomach days, with a frequency that she accepts as simply characteristic of herself. The milk is not always quite right either. The milk arrives in a can each morning brought by the milkman's boy, and it has travelled from wherever the dairy is to Alderton Street in conditions that are not controlled. In cold weather it is probably fine. In the occasional unseasonable warmth of an early April day it is perhaps less certainly fine. You heat it for the children's cocoa and trust the heat to manage whatever the cold couldn't. This is correct reasoning. Heating milk kills bacteria, but you don't know it as reasoning. You know it as what you do, and sometimes the milk is heated enough and sometimes it is heated to just below enough, because the difference is not visible. The flour in the kitchen is not always just flour. This is a thing that the Adulteration of Food Acts of 1860 and 1872 were designed to address. The practice of adding cheaper substances to expensive ones to increase the volume, and therefore the profit, a practice that was so universal in the food trade of early and mid-Victorian England that a government analyst named Arthur Hill Hassell, working in the 1850s, tested hundreds of common foods and found that adulteration was not the exception but the rule. He found chalk in flour and alum in bread and copper sulphate in pickles and red lead in cayenne pepper, and he published his findings in the Lancet, and the country responded with the particular combination of outrage and continuation that it tends to bring to the discovery of commercial fraud. The acts have helped. By 1873 the worst practices are less common, at least in the better shops, and Mrs. Hewson buys from good shops and knows what she's looking at. But alum is still used in bread by some bakers, because alum makes bread whiter and more rises from the same amount of flour, and therefore is more profitable, and alum is not without its effect at regular doses, particularly in children, particularly on the gut, and the specific bilious quality of Edgar's March illness is the kind of thing that could be a lot of different things, and none of them can be measured with certainty in 1873. Let me take you out of the kitchen for a moment. Let me take you to the street. June now, the season that transforms London every year from its winter self to its summer self. The same streets and buildings suddenly in a different light, literally a different light. The grey winter light replaced by something warmer and more revealing that shows both the beauty and the terrible particulars of this city with equal clarity. You have a Thursday afternoon off, not every Thursday. This Thursday, because Mrs. Henderson's sister has come to stay, and the sister's own maid has come with her, and the house is suddenly overstaffed in a way that makes you superfluous until 4 o'clock, and Mrs. Henderson told you this morning that you might take the afternoon if you liked. You like. You have no particular destination. You walk west from Alderton Street toward the Angel, and then south toward the city, because the city on a summer afternoon is worth walking toward. And you have been in Islington for 8 months without seeing much beyond the markets and the shops, and the walk to church on Sunday mornings, and London in June wants to be seen. The streets smell different in June than in November. Not good precisely. London streets in 1873 do not smell good in any absolute sense because they smell of horse dung and coal smoke and the river and the press of human bodies and the particular ferment of a city that has not quite figured out its own drainage yet. But different. The sharpness of winter gone, replaced by something warmer and in some ways more complex. A summer smell that contains more biology in it, more life, more of the city actively living rather than hunkered against the cold. The horse dung in the road is the first thing you notice if you haven't been on a main street in a while. The volume of it. The horses on a London street in 1873 are the engine of the city's economy and the main source of its ambient smell, and they produce what they produce in quantities that are proportional to their importance. And the crossing sweepers work to clear it, but they are overwhelmed, and the summer heat works on the accumulation in ways that add complexity to the ambient air of June that November didn't have. You walk down through Clerkenwell and toward the river, not to cross it, just toward the pull of it, the way you always feel the pull of the Thames in London, the way it is the underlying fact of the city's geography, and you walk along the embankment for a while and look at the water. The Thames in 1873 is not the Thames of the Great Stink. Basil Gett's embankment works changed the river, narrowed and deepened it, moved the sewage outflow further downstream, created the broad stone walkway you are standing on now. The river is better than it was in 1858. It does not smell like it did in 1858, when Parliament had to hang curtains soaked in chloride of lime over the windows because the smell was physically unbearable. That particular crisis is over, but the Thames is not clean. It is not what you would call a healthy river. It is a working river, carrying the exhalations of 3 million people and the drainage of their city. Managed better than it was, but still carrying what it carries. And standing on Basil Gett's beautiful embankment in the summer sunshine, you can smell the river on a warm, still day in a way that resolves as you pay attention to it, sorting itself into layers, the salt and mud of an estuary smell, the coal smoke from the barges, the specific algal note of a river that receives too many nutrients, and beneath all of that, distantly, the managed but not eliminated reminder of what the river is for. You stand there for a while. The city spreads around you in every direction. The dome of St. Paul's visible above the rooftops to the west, the cranes of the docks further east, the bridges, the barges, the constant movement of water and commerce and people. You think about the house behind you, the house you've lived in for 8 months, the house you've lit fires in and carried coal for and cleaned the green wallpaper in and smelled the underlying smell from the kitchen floor and wondered about the wet wall and watched Edgar's face at the kitchen table. You're beginning, in this moment, to understand something that you cannot yet articulate, something that will take you years to put into words, and that even then will not have the words that describe it properly, because the words don't fully exist yet in 1873. The words are being assembled in laboratories, in journals, in the arguments of sanitary reformers and the papers of medical men who are ahead of their time. The words are coming. What you're beginning to understand is that the house is not separate from the body, that what you breathe and touch and drink and eat inside the walls that are supposed to protect you is continuous with the body that breathes and touches and drinks and eats, that the drawing room wallpaper and the basement cesspit and the lead pipe and the coal smoke and the damp behind the paper are not background to your life, but part of it, physically part of it, inside you, accumulated over 8 months in the way that everything accumulates, invisibly, without announcement. You don't have these words. You have a feeling standing on the embankment that is something like seeing the whole of the house from outside for the first time, seeing it as the organism it is rather than the succession of tasks it presents itself as every morning. You walk home. The summer passes differently from the winter. The fires go out, the windows open, the house breathes. Mrs. Henderson's headaches improve. Edgar spends most of July and August in the garden, which is small, a city garden, but green, genuinely green, with a pear tree that produces small hard fruit, and a patch of lawn that he lies on in the afternoon with his legs in the air doing nothing in particular, which is exactly what he should be doing, and the colour comes back into his face, and Mrs. Henderson watches this with a careful, private happiness. You are happier in summer, not just because the work is slightly lighter, the fires not needing daily tending, the coal cellar visited less, because the air is different and the house is different when it breathes, and whatever has been accumulating in the sealed winter rooms has a chance to disperse, and the persistent low-level headache that you've been carrying since November is gone, and you feel what it feels like to not have a headache, which is so much better than you had realised because you had forgotten what it was. You think about this in July when the feeling of not headache is new enough to notice. You lie in your attic room, which is warm now in a way that is almost too warm, the summer heat accumulating in the top of the house, and you look at the plain whitewashed walls of your room, and you think about the green drawing room walls 2 floors below, and whether there is a connection between the wallpaper and the headaches that you cannot prove but feel. You're right, of course. You're exactly right. You're arriving at the right conclusion from the evidence available to you. This is what intelligence does even without training. It notices patterns. You've been noting a pattern for 8 months, comparing November to July, comparing inside to outside, comparing the drawing room smell on cold days to the drawing room smell when the windows are open, and you are arriving at something true. But you are 15 and a housemaid, and you have no authority and no vocabulary for what you suspect. And even if you had both, you would have no mechanism for acting on it in a way that would change anything in this house. Except, in September, Mrs. Henderson does something unusual. She has you move the sofa, not all the way, just slightly, so she can see the section of wallpaper behind it that she noticed herself, apparently, though she did not say so. And when the sofa is moved, she looks at the blistered section for a long time with an expression that is doing something complex. Agnes, she says, and she says it in the tone that means she's thinking out loud more than asking a question. Do you notice anything particular about this room? You think about this for a moment. You could say nothing. You could say what you always say, which is whatever you think the mistress wants to hear. But she is asking you something real, and she's looking at the wall with real attention, and there is something in her face that says she already suspects an answer and is looking for confirmation. The smell, you say. Sometimes, in winter, something sweet, very faint. She looks at you. Where does it smell most? Here, you say, near this wall and in the nursery sometimes. She's quiet for a long moment. Then she goes to the window and opens it, which lets in the September air, and she stands there looking out. I've been reading, she says, half to you and half to the street outside, about wallpaper. There's been writing in some of the papers about the green pigments. You wait. I had not thought it applied to us. I thought it was a question of very cheaply made papers, the kind that you'd find in... She stops. She does not say. The kind of houses that people like you come from. She says, the kind that aren't properly made. Yes, ma'am. This paper was expensive. We chose it from the very best catalogue. Yes, Mum, she turns from the window. She looks at you and she looks at the blistered section of the wall and she looks at you again, and in her face is the particular expression of a Victorian woman of intelligence confronting a domestic problem that she's going to have to solve herself, because no one else in her household will see it as a problem worth solving. I'm going to write to the manufacturer, she says. She writes to the manufacturer. She also writes to her sister, who is married to a doctor in Bristol, and asks about the arsenic question, which her sister takes seriously, and the brother-in-law in Bristol sends back a long letter that contains a great deal of medical qualification, but also, at its core, the admission that yes, there is credible evidence. Yes, arsenic in wallpaper has caused illness. Yes, the green pigments, both the Shields and the Paris green formulations, are the most problematic. Yes, it would not be unreasonable to replace the wallpaper in rooms where children spend time. In November, just as the fires come back on and the windows close, the drawing room wallpaper comes down. It is a disruption. The drawing room is unusable for 2 weeks. The paper comes off in sections, some of it pulling the plaster with it where the damp has made the adhesion too thorough. And behind the paper in several places there is a grey-black growth on the wall that is clearly a mould of some kind, clearly thriving, clearly occupying the exact space between the paper and the plaster, as though it was put there specifically. The new paper is red, a deep Victorian red with a gold pattern, something botanical but without the green, and the manufacturer confirms in a letter to Mrs. Henderson that the pigments used in the new paper contain no arsenical compounds. She has asked specifically and received a specific answer, and she files the letter in her household correspondence folder, where it lives alongside the bills and the tradesmen's invoices as evidence that she has done what needed doing. The nursery paper comes down in December. Edgar's Christmas is better than his last Christmas, measurably better, in the way that a 5-year-old's health can be measured by the fact of him running in the garden and demanding second helpings and sleeping 12 hours straight and waking with colour in his cheeks rather than the winter pallor that Mrs. Henderson has been monitoring with the careful attention of a woman who has been told not to worry while worrying precisely. He still has the lead pipes. He still has the imperfect sewer connection that will require maintenance again in 2 years. He still has the coal fires and the London fog and the food supply chain of Victorian England with all of its particular hazards. He is not safe, not in the way that children are safe in the 21st century with germ theory fully developed, and building regulations and water treatment plants and food labelling and everything that flows from the knowledge that has not yet been fully assembled. But he does not have the wallpaper. This is December 1873. This is 1 year after you arrived at number 14 Alderton Street. You've learned a great deal about houses. You've learned that the house that looks safe can be the thing that harms you. That the poison most likely to hurt you is the one that you don't recognise as poison because it is beautiful, because it is the thing you paid for and chose and arranged to demonstrate who you are and how you live. You have learned that the body is not separate from the building, that what is in the walls is eventually in you through what you breathe and touch and absorb, through the simple fact of living inside a structure that is continuous with your biology, whether you know it or not. You have learned that the people who built these houses were not negligent in any simple sense. They were people with the knowledge available to them in 1851, in 1860, in 1873, building and furnishing and maintaining with the standards of their moment, and the standards of their moment were insufficient for what they were trying to do, which was to create a sealed, comfortable interior world that excluded the dangers outside without understanding all the dangers inside. And you have learned something that it will take you years to fully trust, which is that noticing is not nothing. That the smell behind the sofa and the wet wall in the kitchen and the tight feeling after carpet beating and the pattern of the headaches, these things are information, and information gathered carefully over time leads somewhere real. And the person doing the gathering does not need to have a title or a theory or a medical degree for the information to be true. You're 16 in December. You've been a housemaid for 14 months. Your knuckles crack in the cold and your back speaks to you by 9 in the morning, and you're carrying a year's worth of other people's domestic chemistry in your lungs and your hair and your bones in the way that everyone who works in a Victorian house carries it. But you have also seen things. Let me tell you about the winter of 1873, the full winter, from October through to February, because the winter is the fullest expression of what a Victorian house is and what it asks of you. October begins with the coal. The coal arrives and the fires come on, and you restart the morning routine of the ice bucket and the range blacking and the fire laying that you performed for the first time exactly 1 year ago, and now perform with the ease of long practice. The motion settled into your muscle memory, the way the layout of the streets has settled into your geography, automatic, available without thought. The kettle sings the same way it always does. The fire in the drawing room catches on the first match or not, depending on the humidity that morning. The grate needs blacking on Mondays and Thursdays. The coal scuttle in the study holds 2 hours' worth of fire. And you know all of this now without consulting anyone or counting or guessing. But October is also when you begin to notice the ceiling, the drawing room ceiling specifically, above the fireplace, a round damp patch, not large, not dramatic, perfectly symmetrical in the way of water tracking through a specific path, and around its edge a faint dark line that has the texture of mould even from the floor where you're standing. You mention it to Mrs. Henderson. Mrs. Henderson looks at it and says the chimney stack must be letting in water. The chimney stack is one of 4 that rise from the roof of number 14. They are original, built in 1851, and they have had no maintenance in the 12 years since the Hendersons moved in. Chimney stacks require maintenance. The mortar between the bricks at the top, exposed to 20 years of London weather, frost and rain, and the thermal stress of the fires below, has deteriorated. In places it has deteriorated to nothing, and the rain that falls on the roof of number 14 runs down between the bricks of the chimney stack and finds its way inside and runs down the inside of the flue and soaks into the plaster around the fireplace opening and emerges as a damp circle on the ceiling of the room below. Water in the walls again. Water finding its way in. Victorian England building beautiful things and forgetting to maintain the margins between the beautiful and the weather. The ceiling damp stays through November while Mrs. Henderson waits for the roofman to come, which he will do in February, which is when roofers can actually get to Alderton Street in their schedule, because everyone in Islington has a leaking chimney and there are not enough roofers to address them all immediately. In the meantime, the fire in the drawing room produces the heat that rises up the flue, and the humidity and the smoke that travels up the flue, and the moisture content of the flue that keeps the damp patch damp, and the mould around the edge of the damp patch continues its quiet work. Mrs. Hewson coughs through November. She has coughed every November since she was a girl, and she will cough every November until she dies, which will not be for a long time yet. She is a remarkably sturdy woman, but the cough will always be there. The winter cough, the London cough, the coal and fog cough that belongs to the city the way fog belongs to the river. You cough too. Edgar coughs, but less than last year, noticeably less, and Mrs. Henderson marks this in her private accounting with a careful satisfaction. Charlotte does not cough much. Charlotte, who is 10 now and very certain about things, has decided that coughing is something other people do. December brings the Christmas preparations, which means additional cleaning and additional cooking, and additional coal and additional everything, the house stretched to its fullest domestic complexity, as Mrs. Henderson prepares for the family visits and the dinner and the Boxing Day, and all the associated productions of a Victorian Christmas in a house of this size. You are given Christmas Day itself as a holiday. Half Christmas Day. The morning is yours and the afternoon you're needed for the serving of dinner. In the morning you walk to the church at the end of the street and sit in the back pew and listen to the service, which is good, the choir is good, and the cold inside the church is the particular bone-deep cold of stone buildings that are heated for 1 hour and cool down for the rest of the week. The smell of the church is old and cold and candle wax and the specific human warmth of many people breathing in a small space, and it is entirely different from the smell of the house, and you appreciate the difference. After the service you walk a little. The streets are quiet in the way that Christmas streets always are, the usual commerce absent, the trading shut down, the city resting. London at Christmas is a different city, slower, more human somehow, more capable of something like stillness. You stand on a corner in Islington and look up at the sky, which is grey and low and pressing down on the city with the particular December pressure that means snow is possible. And you think about the house behind you and the year in it, and you think about the things you know now that you didn't know a year ago. The water is lead. The wallpaper was arsenic. The cesspit was in the walls. The coal smoke is in your lungs. The food might be anything. These are the hidden details. These are the things inside every house that look like the furniture of ordinary life and are, in fact, the mechanism by which ordinary life in 1873 is shortened and diminished and made chronically, mysteriously, inexplicably worse. None of this is unusual. That is the important thing. Number 14. Alderton Street is not an unusually dangerous house. It is not a slum. It is not the bottom of Victorian England. It is the middle. It is a house that a solicitor can afford and a family can aspire to, and a cook and a housemaid can be employed in. A house that from the street looks exactly like the civilization that builds it. Solid, respectable, confident in its own arrangements. The arsenic is in the walls of every house with fashionable green wallpaper, which is most of the fashionable houses in England. The lead pipes feed every urban household that connects to the mains. The cesspits beneath many of these houses are in various states of decommissioning. The coal fires burn everywhere. The adulterated food is sold at every market. The damp inhabits every building that was built quickly on London soil and has spent years being sealed against the weather and is therefore retaining every drop of moisture that makes its way in. This is not one house. This is 1,000,000 houses. This is the domestic reality of the most powerful empire in the history of the world, living inside its own beautiful, invisible, slow-working damage, and mostly not knowing, and the ones who suspect not always having the words, and the words being assembled in laboratories and journals, and the letters of worried sisters, and the careful reading of informed women who notice when their children cough. The change comes slowly. It comes through decades. The wallpaper manufacturers are pressured and regulated, and the arsenic pigments are phased out, not immediately, not all at once, but over years. The lead pipes are replaced, city by city, street by street, house by house, over a century, and the last of them are still being replaced in the early 21st century in some places. The cesspits are properly decommissioned as the sewers improve. The coal fires give way to gas and then to central heating, and the London air gets better, slowly, over generations, and the Clean Air Acts of the 1950s finally do in a statutory way what the Victorian sanitary movement was trying to do in a moral one. The germ theory becomes practical knowledge. The bacteria in the food and the water are identified and fought, and the tools to fight them are distributed, and the death rates fall, not all at once, not without resistance, not without the backward forces of people who don't want to change what they don't believe is broken. But they fall. In January 1874, which is the January after the year of this story, you are 17 and you have decided something. You're going to learn to read better. You can read. You were taught at the board school in Hackney before you went into service, and you can manage a newspaper and a letter, and the household accounts that Mrs. Henderson has started letting you help with, which is not a typical task for a housemaid, and which suggests a trust and perhaps an assessment of capacity that you find encouraging. But you want to read in the way that Mrs. Henderson reads, the way that lets you understand the letters from the doctor in Bristol, the way that lets you look up the arsenic question in the medical papers that Mrs. Henderson has started borrowing from the lending library, the way that lets you know what you know rather than just suspect it. Mrs. Henderson notices this. She is a woman who notices things. She is a woman who has spent a year noticing the wrong things about her own house, blaming the weather for what was in the walls, and she is perhaps in this period particularly attuned to the specific alertness of someone who is paying attention and trying to understand what they see. She offers you the use of her own lending library card on Saturday mornings when you have 2 hours. You take it. Saturday mornings in January you walk to the lending library on Essex Road, and you take out whatever you can carry, and most of it is too hard still, the medical terminology a wall of Latin that you don't have the key to yet. But some of it is accessible, some of the reforming pamphlets, some of the sanitary writing, some of the accounts of the adulteration investigations, and you come back from the library every Saturday morning with a piece of something real in your hands, and you sit in the kitchen after Mrs. Hewson has gone to bed, and you read by the range. The range light is not good light. Your eyes hurt by 10 o'clock. You read anyway. This is not a redemption story in the simple sense. You do not study your way out of domestic service and become a doctor. That is not available to you in 1874. The structures that would make that possible do not exist. What you do instead is something smaller and more immediate. You become the person in the household who understands what she is managing. You become the person who knows why the windows should be opened even in the cold of November for 20 minutes each morning, not because the doctor said fresh air, but because you now have the partial vocabulary for ventilation and combustion, and the role of fresh air in diluting what the fires produce. You become the person who can read the manufacturer's label on a tin of paint and understand which compounds to be concerned about. You become the person who, when a new cook arrives in the autumn of 1874 and begins to store the milk in the larder next to the cooked meat, can tell her with quiet authority that this is a mistake and why. This is not nothing. This is, in fact, something. The accumulation of small knowledges in the people who actually run houses, the people who actually touch the walls and breathe the air and manage the daily details of a domestic chemistry, is one of the slow mechanisms by which the Victorian house becomes less lethal. Not through policy, not yet. Through the housemaids and the cooks and the women who run households and read the wrong sections of the lending library, and ask the Bristol doctors for their opinions and make decisions about wallpaper on the basis of evidence that the manufacturers have told them is not real. The wallpaper is real. The lead is real. The cesspit was real. The coal smoke is real. The damp is real. The mould behind the paper is real. These are not theories. These are the details inside every house, the hidden mechanics of the Victorian domestic interior, and they are killing people in numbers that are hard to count, because the cause is always some other thing. Always the winter, always the constitution, always the fog, always the delicate nature that some people have and others don't, never the house, never the beautiful house. It is April again, your second April at number 14. The drawing room is red now. The window is open because Mrs. Henderson has made the 20 minutes of open window each morning a permanent practice. Regardless of the cold, a small revolution in the domestic management of the house that nobody has commented on, but everyone has implicitly accepted. The fires draw well, the chimney having been repointed in February as promised. The coal is good. The water is still lead, but there is a ceramic filter canister that Mrs. Henderson ordered from a shop in Holborn and had installed on the kitchen tap, which does not remove dissolved lead, which nothing available in 1874 removes effectively, but which makes her feel that she's addressing the question of the water, and feeling is sometimes the instrument by which action begins. Edgar is 7. He has grown 2 inches since the previous spring. He is reading faster than he was. His colour is better. Mrs. Henderson does not say anything about this to anyone because she's afraid of committing to a conclusion that might reverse. But you see her watching him in the garden, with the particular expression of a woman who is choosing carefully to allow herself to hope. You are laying the drawing-room fire on a Thursday morning in April when the early light comes through the window, at the angle that makes the room look its best. The red wallpaper warm and deep in the morning light, the fire just beginning to catch. The smell of the room, simply coal and beeswax and nothing else. Nothing underneath, nothing that shouldn't be there. You sit back on your heels and look at the room. The house is not perfect. Houses are never perfect. There are still lead pipes, and still London fog, and still the coal fires that will burn for another 50 years, and still the food chain with its particular Victorian challenges. There is still damp in the walls in places. There is still the roof that will need looking at again next winter. There is still the asymmetric distribution of cold and warmth that means your attic room is too cold in December and too warm in June, and never quite right. But the wallpaper is gone. The cesspit is sealed. The kitchen wall is dry. The windows open each morning for 20 minutes. The filter sits on the kitchen tap and filters what it filters, imperfect but present, a gesture towards something better. And you are here, knowing what you know, carrying it with you. You finish the fire, you stand up, you brush the coal dust from your apron with the reflex that a year of coal fires has made automatic. 3 brisk strokes, the palm flat, and you pick up the ash bucket and you go to the next room. Let me tell you one more thing before I let you sleep. The house that kills you slowly is not the house you think of as dangerous. The dangerous house, in the Victorian imagination and in our own, is the slum, the overcrowded court, the basement room with the water running down the walls and the children who all die before 5. That house is understood as dangerous. It is understood as the result of poverty and neglect and the failure of society to provide. It can be reformed and regulated and the threat identified and named. The house at number 14 is not that house. The house at number 14 is the aspirational house, the house that represents success, The house that is built to standards and furnished with taste and maintained with care. And inside it the hazards are invisible precisely because the house is successful, because success looks a certain way, and anyone looking at number 14 from the street would see only success. The great sanitary insight of the 19th century, the thing that runs through every reformer and every public health advance, from Snow and the pump to Bazalgette's sewers to the Clean Air Acts, is that the environment shapes the body, that what surrounds you is inside you, that you cannot wall yourself off from the world, that the house is not a sealed, safe container, but a permeable boundary between you and everything, and what's on both sides of that boundary matters. This is not a comfortable thought. It is much more comfortable to believe that illness is constitutional, is individual, is the body's own failure rather than the failure of the water or the air or the walls. The constitutional explanation leaves the house innocent. The environmental explanation makes the house culpable, and people don't want their houses to be culpable because the house is what they have, is what they've worked for, is the expression of who they are. The Victorians resisted the environmental explanation for a very long time. They resisted it for reasons that are comprehensible, and then they stopped resisting it and acted on it, imperfectly over generations, and the houses got better, and the children stopped dying at the rates they'd been dying, and the headaches and the stomach complaints and the chronic unspecific unwellness became less chronic, less unspecific, and the names for the things that were causing them eventually came. You are lying in your attic room. It is April. The window is open a crack, the spring air moving through it. Nothing like the sealed winter room. Just the house breathing normally, the way things breathe when you allow them to. Your hands are better in April. The knuckles heal in the warm weather. The cracks close. The skin softens slightly from the rough, dry leather of winter into something that still shows the work but holds it differently. Not broken, just shaped. You're thinking about the drawing room, about the red wallpaper where the green was, about the day you moved the sofa and pressed your hand against the blistered wall and breathed that sweet, faint smell and filed it away with all the other things you'd been filing without knowing where they were going, about Edgar in the garden with colour in his face, about Mrs. Henderson's headaches that have been less this winter than last winter, about the fact that the world is better when you understand it, not perfect, not safe, but better, navigable. The knowledge of what is wrong and why is the first instrument in the work of making it less wrong, and the work of making it less wrong is exactly what people with no authority and no title and no power, except the power of knowing things, have always done. You close your eyes. The sounds of Alderton Street come through the open window, the last of the evening traffic, a dog somewhere, the distant bell of a church marking 10 o'clock. You are warm. You are, by the standards of your life, comfortable. You have food in you and a roof and work that you understand and a skill that is real and a mind that has been given something to do. In the morning there will be coal to carry and fires to light and silver to polish, and the household to maintain in all its daily particularity. There will be water to draw from the lead tap and filtered through the ceramic canister and heated in the range. There will be windows to open for 20 minutes. There will be the house and its hidden workings and the work of knowing it. The spring air moves through the window. Somewhere below you, Edgar is sleeping in his room with the new paper on the walls. Not green, not white either, but a warm cream with a simple repeating pattern that Mrs. Henderson chose specifically because the manufacturer confirmed in writing that it contained no arsenical compounds, and he is breathing whatever the house is breathing tonight, which is better than it was, which is what we're always working toward, better than it was. Centuries will pass. The house at number 14 Alderton Street will be converted into flats in 1936 and converted back into a single-family dwelling in 1987 and sold again in 2003 and renovated with underfloor heating and double glazing and a kitchen extension in the back that covers the ground where the cesspit was. And the new owners will discover when they strip the drawing room ceiling in 2004 that there is still a trace of green pigment in the plaster of the original wall, faint, almost invisible, a ghost of Shields green that survived every subsequent layer of paper and paint because it was in the plaster itself, mixed into the surface, right down to the bone of the building. The lead pipes will be replaced in 1981. The mould behind the ceiling plaster in the nursery will be found and treated in 2004 when the upstairs bathroom floods and the ceiling comes down, and the remediation company will note in their report that there is evidence of long-term moisture penetration and that several species of mould are present and that the ventilation in the room should be improved, and the owners will read this and improve the ventilation and think nothing further about it because they have the vocabulary for damp and mould in a way that the Hendersons didn't, have the instruments to measure it and the materials to address it, and do. The body still breathes what the house breathes. The house is still continuous with the body. The fundamental insight of the Victorian sanitary reformers is still true. You cannot wall yourself off from your environment, not with money, not with taste, not with beautiful wallpaper, not with the conviction that your house is safe because it is yours and you have made it what it is. What has changed is the knowledge that trickled through in letters from Bristol doctors and lending library pamphlets, and the observations of housemaids who noticed the smell behind the sofa and the wet wall by the back door and the pattern of the headaches, and filed them carefully against the day when they would add up to something. The knowledge is public now. The knowledge is everywhere. The hidden details are not hidden anymore, but it took a long time. And in the meantime, in all the November mornings before the knowledge arrived, before the pipes were replaced and the wallpaper reformulated and the cesspits sealed and the Clean Air Acts passed and the water treatment plants built and the germ theory made practical and the houses made to breathe, in all of that time, there were people living inside the invisible machinery of their own beautiful houses, carrying it in their lungs and their bones and their children's developing nervous systems, and most of them didn't know. And the ones who suspected didn't always have the words, and the words were coming slowly, assembled from letters and pamphlets, and the accumulated evidence of everyone who noticed something and said so. You noticed. You said so. That is not nothing. Sleep comes now the way sleep comes after a long day in a house you have learned, after 16 months of coal buckets and fire laying and silver polishing, and the patient, physical work of maintaining a place that is trying, in its Victorian way, to manage the distance between what it looks like and what it is. The window is open. The spring air moves through the room. Your hands are better in April. You are warm enough, fed enough, safe enough, as safe as 1874 can make you, which is not perfectly safe. Not safe in the way that you will be safe 150 years from now, in a house with filtered water and regulated building materials and ventilation standards, and all of the accumulated knowledge of what invisible things in domestic air do to human bodies, but safer than you were in November. That's enough. Let it be enough. The sounds of Alderton Street move through the open window and blur together and become something else, become the sound of a city breathing, The sound of 3 million people in their houses managing the distance between the outside and the inside, between what the house is and what they need it to be, between the world as it is and the world they are working toward. Let the sounds soften. Let the spring air carry them away. Let your breathing slow to the rhythm of the house settling, the wood adjusting to the temperature, the pipes quiet tonight, the range cooling in the kitchen below, the fires out everywhere, the house at rest. Tomorrow the fires come on again. Tomorrow the coal comes out of the cellar and the kettle sings and the day begins its familiar rotation. Tomorrow there is work, but not now. Right now there's only this. The open window and the April air and the city somewhere below continuing without you, doing what cities do, breathing and moving and carrying its 3 million lives through another night. You have earned this rest. Take it. And if you dream of the things you know, the names you have found for things that had no names before, the slow assembling of the knowledge that will change, eventually, gradually, imperfectly, everything. The window is open, the air is clean enough. Good night.